Module 11, negative messages. I really think negative messages are some of the most difficult ones to write, although we've already found that writing positive messages also requires a lot of reader awareness, and that's no different and even more important in negative messages. As our book says, how we present negatives and what we write or say can affect how audiences respond to our messages, as well as how they view us and our organization. And I'm reminded of that old adage, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Well, sometimes in business, we have to deliver negative information. And so how can we do that in a way that really maintains our relationships? There are different types of negative messages. We often, as I said, have to do this in business. We may have to refuse or reject a proposal. We may have to announce a policy that may have negative impacts on our coworkers or customers. We may have to ask for something that the reader may object to. For instance, we may have to ask people to work longer shifts or to change their scheduling. We may have to deliver negative performance reviews or disciplinary notices, and we may have to inform customers of product defects or product recalls. So all of these are instances where, regardless of our desire to have a positive relationship with our customers, coworkers, and supervisors, we may have to tell them negative information. But the keys to delivering effective negative messages are to just continue to be really aware of our readers' reaction and to really try to deliver the message in a way that continues to respect them and considers their emotions and their situation and the context. We also want to be sure to deliver clear and correct correspondence with negative messages and build an image with integrity. And so sometimes delivering this information actually can build a reader's respect for us and integrity if we deliver it in a way that's clearly aware of them and clearly gives complete and correct information in a very kind of respectful and tactful way. One of the key problems with negative messages is the need to manage emotions. We talked about writing emails which were flaming, right? And delaying writing an angry email. Well, it's no different when writing a negative message. And it's even more important to think about not only managing our own emotions, but also the reader's emotions. So Michael Scott is, of course, not someone you want to take your business cues from. He thinks that business is always personal. And that's part of why his office is often dysfunctional, is because everything's always about personal emotions rather than the business at hand. So we want to respect and consider the audience's feelings, but we want to keep ours at home. And as our other module talked about, you don't want to talk about feelings except to congratulate or offer sympathy to the reader. So that was part of our You attitude, or module 6. We also want to think about avoiding negative words and those with negative connotations. And this is actually on pages 272 and 273 of module 15. We want to be sure, and this goes back to that integrity, right? That our words are actually accurate, which is clear and complete, and appropriate. Okay, that has to do with managing the reader's expectations. So we don't want to overpromise, and we don't want to say anything that we can't deliver on. So again, really focused on this consideration of the reader's feelings and on how we represent ourselves with integrity. We also want to consider our own attitude, and this is why sometimes you want to have proofreaders for these messages or potentially delay sending them until you can review them when you are not necessarily so emotional. And so one thing that you want to consider is the attitude that you bring to the message, okay? Some ways that we can do this is to be sure to consider, as we're writing, our role and our relationship with the reader and how that might affect our tone and politeness and the power relationships between us. So we want to be really polite in negative messages especially. We want to use courtesy titles. We want to avoid imperatives or giving orders unless we have some kind of supervisory role. So for instance, if you're writing to your supervisor as a subordinate, you don't want to use a sentence like email me as soon as possible, because that can be seen as being really negative and really demanding. And so that can actually come across as very inappropriate. Even when you are writing to your subordinates, you still want to consider using more politeness when your request is particularly inconvenient or potentially something negative that they may not want to comply with. Okay, so basically check your implied attitude. Is your personal bias or emotion bleeding through? You just want to leave that at the door. Again, we want to leave our own feelings at home, even as we try to manage the emotions and feelings of our audience. Regarding reader awareness and respect, we want to consider whether or not we're writing to a customer, a supervisor, or a coworker. And this is really going to change how we present the information and what we include. That also affects our primary goal or purpose. So for instance, in terms of information, customers don't need your personal information or feelings about the topic or company gossip. So for instance, background issues, things that created the problem, customers don't need those. Also, supervisors don't want to hear complaining or tattling or blame. They just want the problem solved. And coworkers don't want to be blamed or talked down to. They want to be respected and included in the decision-making process. And so in order to do that, we change our organization of the message to accommodate those purposes and reader needs. We also want to avoid presenting a poor image of our company, because going back to that notion of integrity, that damages your own personal integrity. And so you really want to manage that and not do things like badmouth the company or provide details that are just gossip or catty. So this is our metaphor is a sandwich for negatives, okay? We try to actually really sandwich the negative in the middle in order to de-emphasize it and emphasize goodwill at the top and the bottom of the message where reader attention is high. Our book will talk specifically about using a buffer, and I just want to caution you that using a buffer can delay the negative and focus on the positive at the beginning, but in some instances that indirectness or delay is seen as inappropriate and somewhat suspicious. And so it can seem really insincere to customers and to your supervisors. It just seems like you're delaying or denying the inevitable. In terms of organization, for customer messages, your number one purpose is goodwill. And so we begin with the reason, and I'm going to talk below here about how we actually do this to hide the refusal within the reason. And so your refusal will often be either here or connected with this first paragraph. But we want to provide the reason first, because often people stop listening once they've heard the negative. And so if it's really important for the customer to understand the reason or rationale for why they have received a refusal, you want to put that up front before their attention goes away and gets focused on the refusal itself. Now, we also want to not get a bad reaction from the customer, and that will come specifically from them feeling like their options are limited or you've somehow limited their freedom. The book talks specifically about that as psychological reactance, okay? And in order to avoid that, we're going to go ahead and put alternatives into the message in order to give them a perception of choice or additional routes that they can take. That'll give them more of a sense of freedom. We also, as I mentioned, all of our business organization is actually just a modification of this notion that we put our purpose in the beginning, that we then put the details in the body, okay? And that we always end on some kind of goodwill ending or next step, which is our closing. So in terms of this, we really want to consider whether or not we want the correspondence to continue, and we want to avoid insincere endings, okay? And so in order to do that, we really have to consider whether or not this refusal is meant to put an end and close the door on the conversation. If that's the case, do not end with a please call me or feel free to ask questions, or you want to avoid that unless you really mean it. Okay. Additionally, some other things to consider. You want to try to avoid saying you can't do things. You want to focus instead on what you can offer the customer and what they can do, which goes back to this idea that you want to give them options, and you don't want to have a negative image of your company. You want to really talk about your services rather than your limitations. So avoid limitations if you can. You also, with negative messages, really want to consider legalities. You don't want to apologize or offer promises that you cannot deliver on. You also don't want to, in giving your reasons, talk so extensively about the decision-making process that you get your corporation or company into trouble because you find you get basically talked your way into a loophole. So often saying less is more, and you want to consider the legal implications. Say only what you need to, be direct, be respectful, but don't go out of your way to gush and say more than you really need to. Additionally, if the reason that you are actually giving the refusal is altogether weak, omit it. Just give the refusal, move on to the alternatives, and then focus on whatever the goodwill ending or next step is. That said, you don't want to badmouth the company or pass the buck. So if the reason is just that it's company policy, don't default to that. That actually seems like it's okay, but what that really does in terms of your integrity is makes the customer feel that you're separate from the organization and that you yourself think the organization is bad. And that's really bad. You don't want to do that. You want to focus on that goodwill. And so don't badmouth the company, don't pass the buck, take responsibility and present some kind of very, as I've shown here, confident presentation of yourself and the company that has integrity and takes its responsibility seriously. Now, if you're writing to a superior, again, as we mentioned, superiors don't want to hear whining. They don't really want to hear about your problems or tattling or blame. The key thing for them is to get the job done. And so what you really want to focus on in negative messages to superiors is the solution to the problem. In the very beginning, in the purpose or opening, you want to make sure to give that shared problem and, if you can, highlight that solution right up front. Then comes any details or background that they might need to understand why the problem happened and what you're doing to solve it. If there are multiple options for solutions, give the alternatives, explain the disadvantages and advantages of each, and then in the very end, your next step or goodwill close is to recommend a solution and ask for their approval. Whatever that next step is, let them know what needs to be done to move the job forward. If you're talking to coworkers, again, we talk specifically about how your coworkers want to feel that you care about their input into the problem and into the solution. They don't want to be blamed or talked down to. And so in terms of talking to them, you want to ask for their input if it's really going to be followed. Now, don't do this insincerely, but you also want to address the problem as shared. Again, don't pass the buck, but talk about how all of you are involved. Talk about you as a group and as a team. We're really trying to build goodwill here and address this ourselves as a group. So address the problem as shared, provide the alternatives or options, and then request their input if that's what's needed, or request the action that's required. And just be very direct about that, as well as respectful. Again, considering buffers, that can delay the negative in order to build goodwill and give you time to talk about positives in the message, but it can be dangerous because some audiences, like your supervisors and customers, may see that as indirect, insincere, and suspicious. Subject lines are really important in negative messages. You should never put a negative into the subject line unless you think the reader won't open or read the message otherwise. Ideally, you want the subject line to be neutral, or if you're writing to like coworkers or your boss, you want to focus on the solution or the proposal for the solution rather than the problem. So don't state the problem in the subject line, state the solution. And throughout your messages, and we're going to talk some more about this, this goes back to Module 16 and really revising and tightening your writing. You want to be specific and clear about the information. This really goes back to what our key strategies are for negative messages, right? We want to respect the reader. Whoops, one more. And we want to make sure that we give clear and correct correspondence. And the way to keep our correspondence clear and correct is to really be specific. And so you want to talk about the reader's requests specifically and utilize their language. That'll refer back to previous correspondence and allow them to orient themselves to what you're talking about. So if that means actually using the order number or invoice number, or talking about the problem using their language from a previous correspondence, that'll help you to get right to the problem and talk specifically about their issue. You also want to give specific reader benefits and focus on what the reader can do and not limitations in general. Of course, in negative messages, we're not often talking about reader benefits, right? We're actually talking about alternatives. And so this is where we want to talk about not limitations, but what can the reader do? What is open and available to them. Okay, so think about your alternatives in the same ways that you would think about reader benefits. And so here I just have a really funny little ad or comic strip. It says, as you suggested, I made a list of my professional goals. Make Ed stop blowing his nose when I'm on the phone, convince Cheryl and Sandra to wear less perfume, get to the break room faster when I smell popcorn. Again, you can see how just being negative in your presentation at work rather than positive, and we'll talk about positive emphasis in our negative messages when we talk about Module 7, is really gives you a bad image of you, not the other people, but in fact you, your professional integrity is diminished by that kind of negative thinking. And so even as we use negative messages, again, we're really just focused on the positive and on delivering the information as clearly and specifically and respectfully as we can.